Welcome back. This is our second lecture in Introduction to Psychology. In this lecture, we're going to look at some of the more modern schools of psychology. We're going to look at their founders. We're going to look at some of their assumptions. We're going to look at their contributions to modern psychology and some of, let's say, the emphases and biases that each of these schools and perspectives has. So let's look at our roadmap. The first thing we want to do is who are the major figures in various psychological perspectives. Inside these different schools, who are the key figures who kind of outlined them and did some of the founding research in each of these perspectives. Then we're going to look at what some of these key beliefs and findings of these different schools are, which means where they made their contributions, how they believe that psychology should be done, and what some of the research they did that kind of supported these beliefs and these implications of their thought. And lastly, we're going to look at some of the relative emphases and biases that come with each school. I think it's more important that it's not like one of these schools is right and the other ones are all wrong. It's more that each of them brings kind of part of the overall image, or to use a psychological term, they all kind of contribute to the Gestalt, how the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And each of them kind of made a major contribution in a different area of psychology and helped build the overall field of psychology. So we're going to start by looking at William Wundt. And William Wundt is the first person to use this term psychology to describe his research. And he was someone that was kind of important in separating psychology as kind of a social science from the field of philosophy. And so Wundt was a German working in the mid to late 1800s. His field was called structuralism. We'll explain a little bit more what that means in a second. But kind of building on our previous lecture, Wundt was very influenced by Immanuel Kant in the idea that he believed that consciousness, or the mind and thought, had a variety of different categories that the mind used to filter experience. And so he was really trying to break down and try to understand the structure of consciousness and the structure of thought, which meant that he wanted to break down thought not as a whole, but break it into separate different components and see how those components work together to create the overall, let's say, consciousness that an individual has. So building on Kant and the idea that humans had ideas in their mind that preceded their sense experience, he was looking at for those types of things. So he kind of separated consciousness into two different parts. The first one were objective sensations, and the second one were subjective feelings. Now, objective sensations means the things that we would all share from observation. So, for example, if you were, let's say, eating an apple, you could notice that it had certain objective characteristics. So, the roundness of its shape, the color, the redness or its color, how it tasted, how it smelled, and these sensations would be universal across a lot of different individuals. So everyone would take in the same information. So Wundt is not kind of taking this perspective that our senses are deceiving us, or that our senses are perhaps subjective to different people. He's saying that part of, let's say, understanding when the sensations that we take in from the external environment are more or less objective. They are what they are, and that what the senses are recording are true. However, he separated these from what are your subjective feelings, which means that how we feel in response to these objective sensations is different for each person. So, for example, one person might see an apple as, let's say, who's hungry and sees the apple. The other one can be nostalgic because it reminds them of their childhood days. Another one could hate apples because they had a bad experience with apple pie or things of that sort. And that we have these different subjective feelings, for example, based on our memory of experiences or our memory of the sensation. And what he was trying to get at is a connection between these objective sensations of observations about the world with the internal life that was subjective. So that part of it was universal, and another part of it was, individual by individual. So the way that he did this, and his basic method was introspection. So he kind of had systematic diaries where he would ask himself and also his followers to observe their own mental processes. So, for example, what were you feeling and what were you thinking when you had different types of sensations? Meaning, like, you saw, he would expose you to different types of things, and then he would ask you to record your mental state. And this is partly because you can't actually see a thought, you can't see psychological constructs, you really can't see, or I should say, you can't see anyone else's mental processes, but you could perhaps appreciate your own. And by introspection, looking into yourself and recording what your thoughts were when you were having different sensations or making different observations, would be a way of understanding the connection between the objective sensations and the subjective feelings. So what Wundt was really emphasizing was that we can break consciousness into different parts and therefore understand the structure of consciousness. As a result, Wundt was very influential in what is now known as cognitive psychology because he was trying to understand the process by which we take in information from our environment and how we process that information and how we lead to kind of conclusions. And so he is kind of an important figure for kind of like the academic study of psychology, meaning that it's not based upon curing people's illnesses. It's not based on, let's say, making recommendations about how to approach different areas. Like, for example, someone who's more interested in educational psychology. He was really trying to get at what is this thing called thought, what is consciousness, and how can we appreciate what that is. And that kind of really is the modern field of cognitive psychology. Our second figure is an American named William James, who was working roughly about the same time as William Wundt, and he was a professor at Harvard University. Now, he kind of spans several different fields. So James is known for being an important philosopher, particularly with a kind of a theory called pragmatism in terms of how to approach the world. He made some studies of religious experience, so he's a little bit of a sociologist, a little bit of an anthropologist. So he really was someone that was involved in a lot of different fields. But where he's important in psychology is that he wrote really the first textbook in psychology called Principles of Psychology. And he's famous for saying is the first time I ever heard a lecture in psychology was listening to my own lecture that I gave to my undergraduate students. James has also coined the term stream of consciousness. And if you've heard this term stream of consciousness, you probably think of, let's say, kind of a variety of different thoughts that kind of go through your head at a different time. These thoughts are necessarily are not necessarily connected to each other, and that you kind of, in a sense, don't have any control of them. And there's not really a lot of organization. It's kind of like loose associations and stream of things. Sometimes a reaction to environmental stimuli, sometimes because the mind is wandering. But the reason, what we meant originally by this term stream of consciousness is that even though it's kind of connected and you can only appreciate it as a whole. And he kind of rejected Wundt's kind of approach that was trying to break thought down into its component parts. James's school is generally called functionalism, and I'll explain what that means by functionalism. What he was interested in is mostly how your mind adapts to its environment, which means that the environment has certain structures to it, and you have to adapt your mind to be best suited to that environment. And in this way, he was influenced by Locke because he did believe in that the environment has a huge impact on how the mind develops, and particularly that you learn through experience and practical, you learn through senses and through your experience. And how basically the mind is what is being shaped by the environment. The mind is not shaping the environment, is basically a way of summarizing William James's perspective. Now, while Wundt emphasized his method of introspection, looking into yourself to understand mental processes, James emphasized observation. So he would send his students out to observe different situations, and particularly to observe people in important situations and understand what was their psychology and what they were reacting to their environment. So what he rejected, the reason why he's called functionalism is that he believed that your thought had to be functional to your environment, which means that all thought, all psychology, all mental processes served a purpose. They weren't just, in a sense, unconnected. They weren't just, in a sense, disembodied from the individual. If you had a certain psychological approach, it was because it actually worked or adapted you to a particular environment that you were dealing with. And as a result, you couldn't break consciousness down to its individual parts. You had to see consciousness and the mental processes as a whole. Where James is also really important is kind of stems from his philosophy of pragmatism, which is that he believed that people learned in a trial and error, or learning by doing. And so in this way, he kind of had an idea that you interact with your environment, you have a certain psychological outlook, it's either adapted or maladapted to that environment, and by making mistakes, you improve, let's say, and you become better adapted to your environment, and in a sense, more functional within a certain context. So last thing about William James is that he had a huge influence on educational psychology because some of his contemporaries included John Dewey and Edward Thorndike, who were kind of really the founding figures in modern educational theory in America, and mostly ones that emphasize a progressive approach to education, one that emphasized like hands-on and activities and learning by doing and practical skills, and kind of a rejection of esoteric or academic kind of ways of approaching education. And so William James was kind of in the middle of this, and because he was someone who dabbled in a lot of different fields, his influence of his psychological perspective had influence in a variety of different related fields around psychology. So our third is probably the most famous, Sigmund Freud, and his approach was called psychoanalysis, which we'll get a little bit more to in a second. I think Freud's main contribution is not so much that people follow his theories today, or he has that psychoanalysis is a huge role in modern psychology. In some ways, it's been separated from psychoanalysis is treated almost as a separate field from mainstream psychology because it kind of has a much different approach, and it's in a sense more in a way not trying to explain how the mind thinks and not trying to explain behavior, but as a way of treating people who are suffering from, let's say, mental problems. And so Freud's contribution is mostly in the area of abnormal psychology, but even within that, he's kind of, let's say, an acquired taste, and which means that some people like Freud, but a lot of people feel very uncomfortable with his ideas. We'll get more to that in a moment. But certainly, most people who think about psychology have heard of Sigmund Freud. This is, he's usually characterized or caricatured by holding like a large cigar in his hand. He has a distinctive kind of like white beard, sometimes with round, let's say, eyeglasses that make him kind of, let's say, a recognizable figure when you see kind of headshots or cartoons of, let's say, the founders of psychology. So Freud was trained as a doctor, and the way you might think about his approach to psychology is that he saw it as mental medicine. He was treating sick people and trying to help these sick people get back to wellness. And so he was noticing that a lot of people were having problems with stress or hysteria or other types of diseases, and he would have them in his office, and just like any doctor, he would ask them about their symptoms, he would ask them about how they felt, and he would try to diagnose what was wrong with them. And from this kind of medical practice, he kind of developed a way of, let's say, an approach to a way of treating people's problems, and you might call this talk therapy, which means that he would have people talk about their problems, talk about their experiences, and while listening to them, try to, let's say, diagnose what was their fixation and what was their complex that they were dealing with. We'll get a little bit more into what Freud did and what things he emphasized in this, but I think we need to go back a bit to talk about what were essential beliefs about how the mind worked. And I think that he saw psychology mostly about ego integrity, which means coming to a self that is balanced and one that you accept. And so in a sense, and he would suggest that is very difficult, that, yourself is not just there ready to be picked up, that you have to kind of develop yourself over time. But this was difficult because your personality was often in conflict. And so if you, things like split identity or multiple identities, and that your identity is conflict, were kind of central to Freud's understanding about how the brain worked. Kind of drawing upon Plato, he had a kind of a notion of a tripartite personality, which meant that your personality is not like a whole that works together, but it has, let's say, competing elements to it. And he named these elements the superego, the ego, and the id. And the superego could think about of our moral self, the one, our conscience, the one that reminds us about society's conventions. You could think of it as your parents or as your society's leader, kind of voice in your ear telling you what the right thing is to do. The id kind of represents the animalistic part of your personality, the zone of instincts and impulses and drives and urges, things like need for hunger, sex drive, biological needs, etc., and therefore always kind of pushing and overwhelming rational thought. And in the middle, you had your ego, which is your self-concept, that was worn between kind of these like good angel and bad angel on your shoulders. And so what he saw driving most of this is this personality conflict between these three parts of your personality, and you're trying to, in a sense, integrate them into, let's say, a healthy whole. So two things that, I think Freud emphasized much more than most any other thinkers is the centrality of the unconscious. Well, most of them thought the unconscious was kind of a secondary thing to your rational mind or to your consciousness that you were aware of. Freud was very clear that he believed the unconscious mind was where most of the action was happening, that most of what drives our motivations and most of what explains our behavior is not the rational part, but kind of like the iceberg I showed you in the previous lecture, is that your rational mind is just the tip of the iceberg, and most of your psychology is actually submerged and below the surface, and that things that are happening in your unconscious are really driving, let's say, the things you need, the complexes that you're having, the difficulties you're having with a variety of different things in the psychological field. And he basically thought that if you can understand the unconscious or get access to your unconscious mind, you would be able to address some of your problems. So to go back kind of to his method, that by talking to, let's say, a psychologist, you would reveal, or that by listening to you and by probing questions, you would reveal what your fixations, your hang-ups were in your unconscious mind. You would become more aware of them because a psychologist would point out to things that you said and try to make connections for you and allow you to, in a sense, bring your unconscious self into your conscious awareness. And by becoming aware of it, then you can deal with some of these problems by unearthing some of the conflicts that you have buried in your subconscious. Now, another key part was the centrality of sexuality. And sexuality is not like physical sex. It's not about like, sexuality is not the same thing as sex. But he felt that sexuality means your affections and your attractions to various different individuals in your life, both friendships and romantic relationships and relationships within the family, was a core thing that was driving a lot of these things. So for example, that the fact that people would repress parts of their sexuality created many of the unconscious conflicts that Freud was discovering. And therefore, he was trying to, particularly remember, he was late 1800s is the Victorian period where sexuality was widely repressed in many European societies, that he felt that if we brought these kind of sexual urges and drives to the surface and understood them better, you would be able to get to more ego integrity than you would otherwise. But a lot of people have criticized Freud because it seems like every explanation of every psychological aspect of your life is kind of rooted in some type of sexuality, which means an attraction for your mother or father, a need to replace them, a competition with your same sex, meaning you're this parent of the same sex or same gender as you. Now that's kind of how Freud thought about over 100 years ago. Obviously, these connections could be even more complex today in our understanding of, let's say, individual sexuality. But he basically said he kind of put sex at the core of understanding individual psychology, in part because I think people's sexual urges are something that comes out of their unconscious, something that they're not always aware of, something they can't always explain to themselves, and therefore it was a major, let's say, element in people's unconscious minds. A fourth school, and also kind of equally famous for the Freudians, is the behaviorist school. And this is kind of, let's say, something that emerged in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and really was tied into academic psychology, meaning college professors in psychology departments who are trying to understand and make their field scientific, and by doing that, basing it in objective observations, meaning looking at behaviors, things that people could see, and basically focusing on that to the exclusion of trying to more abstract or more soft descriptions of mental processes that were more based upon a subjective understanding of what was going on. The key ideas in this field are the conditioned response, which means that you could condition people to respond in a certain way by training them through a series of rewards and punishments, and particularly about the idea of reinforcement or reinforcing behavior. So that once you had a connection between, let's say, a behavior and, let's say, an incentive structure in your environment, you could use either rewards or punishments to kind of, in a sense, either foster or extinguish a certain type of behavior. Their school is called Behaviorism because their focus was that since you can't see mental processes and they're intangible and that they're subjective, we should focus on things that are objective, meaning observed behavior. That they're not really interested in what's going on inside your head. They're just more interested in how different variations in the environment lead to different variations in the behavior of the individual. The belief both of B.F. Skinner and James Watson was that the mind is molded by training, which means that you can train someone to do almost anything through a system of rewards and punishments. And usually by making a connection and either having a certain activity associated with positive or negative feelings, and those negative feelings meaning like comes from the punishments that are associated with a certain activity, and the positive feelings are derived from the rewards. Watson in particular had a relatively famous experiment, which even something as simple as fear could be a trained response. So that he found a child of one of his friends. He noticed this child had an affection for a rat, and he was wondering that if he could train this child who clearly loved or had an affection for this rat as a pet, could learn to fear that rat through a conditioned response and through, let's say, reinforcement. And so what Watson did is that every single time the child held a rat, he created like a disturbing noise. And so what happened is this small child learned to associate that noise with the rat and started to become to fear this rat. And so what Watson showed here is that you can change people's relationships to things simply by, in a sense, either punishing behavior that you dislike or rewarding behavior that is positive. And therefore you could change love into fear simply as a trained response. B.F. Skinner did many famous experiments kind of in the same vein by doing trained rat and trained pigeon experiments in particular. During World War II, B.F. Skinner actually trained pigeons to operate, let's say, torpedoes, and he trained the pigeons to kind of, they would be inside the torpedoes and they would peck at certain things as a way of, let's say, steering the torpedo to make sure that it hit the object. And so he showed that even animals that seem to be relatively simple or not very high up on the intelligence scale could lead to trained behavior. And I think the key thing with B.F. Skinner is that he didn't believe that it was just animals that could be trained, just like we train our pets to do tricks or to sit or to shake your hand or things of that sort. Humans could be trained as well. Now, the key method here was an experiment. And so the typical way that a behaviorist would go is that you would have individuals and they would have different environments they were in. So different rewards and punishments, and they would see if their behavior changed in response to a reward or a punishment in their environment. So they basically saw the mind as a calculating machine that would kind of, let's say, connect, try to avoid pain and to increase pleasure, and basically making that calculation, deciding how it responded to its environment. As I kind of said before, that they thought behavior was much more important than understanding the mental process. They didn't really care why you understood you were doing something. They were only looking for the change in behavior in response to the environment. And so I put scientific kind of in quotations. They certainly thought of themselves as scientists, and they certainly thought their research is objective. But to the extent that, science has a broader meaning, I don't want to say that they were scientific. I don't want to say that that was kind of their approach or their orientation. In contrast to someone like Freud, who saw himself mostly as a doctor, not as a researcher, or someone like Wilhelm Wundt, who is kind of, let's say, one foot in philosophy and another one in psychology, or even someone like William James, who was once again more of a polymath that worked in a lot of different fields. So another school is called, comes out of Germany, and I'm not going to talk about, there's a variety of different people associated with the Gestalt approach, but Gestalt basically is a German term for shape or form. And what the Gestalt psychologists emphasize is that there is the whole versus the sum of its parts, and how the mind organizes something where it doesn't see the individual components, particularly of a visual, something that's visually experienced, but how your mind kind of organized them and imposed an order or an arrangement on them that wasn't actually just there out in the reality. So Gestalt approaches are mostly, I think they are similar to Kant because they see the world as the mind imposes order on the senses instead of the senses shaping the mind. So they did a lot of contributions in the field of perception, which means that how you can use optical illusions in trying to explain how optical illusions exist, which means that in different contexts, your mind would visually organize what you're seeing in different ways. And in terms of like kind of their theory of learning, while the behaviorists emphasize repetition or reinforcement as the basis for learning, Gestalt kind of saw kind of a flash of brilliance or insight that when you look at things in a different way, you come to a different conclusion, and that's the insight, and that's really what learning is about. It's not just a change in behavior, it's a change in perspective and perception of the problem. So on the lower part of the slide, I give some of the principles that are usually associated with Gestalt thought, and a lot of these are just like if you see a random arrangement of circles and lines and how your mind puts them together. So the law of closure is that if you have an incomplete like polygon, your mind wants to draw in the missing lines to make it a complete, see the full shape like a diamond. Different arrangements, that things that are similar, even if let's say they're different colors, that you see as being part of the, a whole. And that when you kind of have a line continuity, meaning that you see that, like, so all these dots might be just random dots, but you see it as dots in a line, in a curved line. And over on the right hand side, you see kind of the pole going through the S, is that even those could be two separate objects, that you see it as a kind of an object that's going through the S instead of kind of two objects, one on the upper part and one on the lower part of the S. Another key thing for Gestalt is kind of figure ground segregation, which means something on about how something stands out from its background. And what they would do is a lot of experiments that in different contexts, how something would either fade into the background or stand out from the background. But so let me just give a few examples of explaining how they would approach the idea of how context could change your impressions coming from your senses. So they would do things like if you had a round circle, same shaped round circle, two of them, one of them being surrounded by smaller circles and the other one surrounded by larger circles. And usually, even though they were the same size and shape and usually the same color, if it was surrounded by smaller circles, you would perceive that the one in the center was larger. But if the one in the center was surrounded by larger circles, you would perceive the one in the center as being smaller. So that would be an example of kind of a context experiment. Another one is that if you drew, let's say, wrote the number 13, and you put it in the context of letters. So for example, if I had the letters A, then 13, C, D, you would see the 13 not as a number, but you would see it as kind of an incomplete letter B. So for example, the vertical line and then kind of, let's say, the 3 being the round curves of the letter B. But if I put the same exact shape in a different context, so instead of putting it around letters, I put it around other numerals. So for example, if I had that 13 and I had around it 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, I would perceive exactly the same thing as a numeral because the context is providing a clue for me to interpret what's in my visual field. So I'm not going to go through this slide, but these are just some of the kind of general Gestalt principles that are very often featured in design work, particularly graphic design, because I think of the major contribution to Gestalt is how visual context kind of shapes how we see things, like in arrangements. So that whether things are close together, whether they're kind of similar, we see them as, so for example, you see a series of similar shapes, you're going to assume that they have kind of a similar function, so like choices on a menu bar. Another one is that things you see very often, you go for the simplest interpretation of what it can be. So for example, on the left-hand side, two long rectangles, one short rectangle looks like a login form. And figure ground, enclosure of different regions. I encountered some of this when people looked about the psychology of mapping, and one of my professors, who was a kind of a behavioral geographer, tried to draw lines through different shapes. So the perception is like, is a road going through on the side, on the edge of different, let's say, areas. And so he was trying to think about how people interpreted and dealt with spatial relationships. So some more modern perspectives include a biological perspective, and this is mostly driven by kind of advances in medical technology and on biological understanding. While in the past we would not have been able to see into the brain because we didn't have the technology to make scans and understand what was going on with mental processes, the best we could do is introspect on our own mental processes as a way of capturing them. But as we've been able to study brain activity, the fields of neuroscience, and sometimes termed, and I put in quotations because I think whenever I hear someone say brain science, it's usually not very scientific. I've come to the conclusion that all psychology is based upon biology or anatomy or physiology, meaning that our thoughts are not separate from our organic selves, which means that something about hormones flowing through our body, electrical impulses in our brain, are the source of our consciousness and our thoughts and our mental activity. And therefore they want to, in a sense, root all the conclusions they have about mental processes based on observable brain activity. And because we have CAT and PET scans now, we can measure blood flow or chemicals in different brain regions, and therefore we can track what's happening when people are engaging in different activities and really make these mental processes manifest and bring them to the surface. So here on the right, you see one kind of, let's say, brain scan, and it's supposedly compared, usually side by side with a healthy brain alongside an abused brain. So someone that experienced deprivation or someone that went under physical or emotional abuse as a child. And what they're trying to say is that you can see a difference in the pattern. And the reason why they can measure like blood flow is because there's some iron in your blood, and therefore with a magnetic resonance imaging, you can pick up, let's say, areas that have more blood flow than others, and assuming the idea that if there's more blood flow in one region of the brain, that part of the brain is more active, and that's explaining, let's say, your mental state in that situation. But this has also become really important with the kind of understanding of concussions, and that if you look at a pre-concussed and a post-concussed brain, you can see different brain activity, indicating that concussions are having some long-term impact on, let's say, personality, response, cognitive processes, and things of that sort. The other part of the biological perspective is pointing to the importance of hormones and genes on behavior. So we all know that, hormones might drive our mood, either like, excited or, in a sense, sedate, or let's say irritable, etc. That hormones, and not just, let's say, our thoughts, might have more to explain that. So for example, a typical depressed teenager might not respond or might not be able to articulate a certain concern or a problem as the root cause of their feelings, but we know that we can probably find higher levels of certain hormones in their system if they're expressing certain types of feelings. And we might be able to address that chemically by using a pharmaceutical to, let's say, address the chemical imbalance in the body. There also tends to put more of an emphasis on genes as an explanation of behavior. Once again, genes being part of your biological organic self. And so that's going to be the emphasis. And a lot of this is that it is drawing upon biological sciences as the basis for psychology. One more controversial field is what might term the evolutionary perspective. And this is just basically applies the principles of evolutionary selection to mental traits and behaviors. Usually evolution is applied to physical traits such as eye color or shape or size or height. But an evolution perspective in psychology tries to explain different psychological tendencies as a product of evolution. So this is like many ideas about evolution. These are sometimes very controversial ideas because it's not clear why a psychological trait is something that can be passed down from parents to children. Especially if you think psychology is something that's in the control of the individual and is reacting to the environment. There's no reason why you might think that that psychological traits are the result of genetics. Also, that some of the conclusions that have come out of this field have been perhaps a bit more than a bit misogynistic, in the terms that they rationalize bad behavior by men and they do not take seriously some suffering of women, and their explanations are in some ways too pat. Another part to this is that it's hard. Evolution is a group characteristic. It's most usually talking about traits in a population of animals, including humans, while psychology is mostly focused on individual characteristics. So some of this goes back to an evolutionary biologist named Richard Dawkins, and he wrote a book in the 1970s called The Selfish Gene. And this idea that a lot of behavior is by the genes wanting to propagate themselves, and therefore genes pass on certain traits to their carriers that explains some of their behavior. And their explanation of their behavior is trying to maximize the spread of their genes among the overall population. So that one thing that Dawkins conclusion that's been drawn from this by various different authors is that this explains why men might cheat on their spouses or their romantic partners because they're trying to spread their genetic material to the largest amount of individuals. It also might explain why women nurture, and some of the in the sense that they are taking care of their offspring and they're trying to get their offspring to adulthood, once again to pass on their genes to the next generation, so that kind of the men are from Mars, women are from Venus, the differences between the sexes, but trying to explain that from an evolutionary perspective. One other thing about the selfish gene is that, trying to explain what altruism is. Why do we stand by our friends, but also our family members, and we seem to have an outsized loyalty to people who are in our kin group or in our friendship group. And some of this is said that it's based upon evolutionary imperatives, that if you protect those around you that share your same genetic material, even if you're not able to pass your individual genetic material, people in your group that also share it are going to be able to pass it on to the next generation. But even more so, the evolutionary perspective tries to explain certain types of instincts that we have as humans that are shared across many different groups. So one of them might be the fight or flee instinct, which means that when you feel threatened, you either, in a sense, get hostile in the sense of defending yourself, or you try to flee the situation. And we can kind of see this when people feel threatened, that they have, let's say, a response that can be measured chemically in terms of their body chemistry, but also the feeling of tension when you're feel in a trap situation. It might also explain things like territoriality, in the sense that people feel they have an ownership or personal space, but also kind of the idea that they have a zone around them, and that this might be based in things about the need to have territoriality to keep out competitors or enemies from your personal space. Some of this is focused on the development of different senses, particularly sight and smell, that certain things why we find some things beautiful or attractive. The explanation of romantic attraction, why that people tend to favor certain body types or certain traits, is because that they associate these with healthy spouses who will be able to pass their genes or superior genes onto the next generation. And so what we think is an individual choice in terms of who we like and who we pair up with. It might be more about kind of the evolutionary imperatives that we've inherited, and these manifest themselves as psychological states. Another part of this is just that, for example, that we tend to like people that share our facial features, so that parents and children, that, the difference between biological parents and sometimes adopted parents is that biological parents might see kind of a physical similarity in their biological children's faces, and therefore might have a connection to them. This is not saying that adopted children are not cared for or not loved by their parents, but the idea that there's affinity that develops in human groups to those that you share some kinship with, particularly a biological kinship, is maybe based on an evolutionary process, that this perspective. Now, I want to also emphasize that this perspective is very controversial. I don't think all their claims are proved, but the point is that these ideas are out there and people are applying them to psychological research. So the big problem here is that evolution mostly describes the characteristics or traits found in a population or a group of individuals, while psychology is focused on individual characteristics. So there's a little bit of an aggregation problem here. From the evolutionary perspective, it might be too functional because everything that exists is presumed to be chosen for, even though its appearance might be more accidental than, let's say, by a process of evolutionary selection. Another perspective is the cognitive perspective, and this is a perspective that basically sees the brain as like a computer, and that what your thoughts are basically information processing, which means you take in information from your environment, you kind of filter that information through your brain, and then you have output functions, which means based upon this information and your filtering and sorting process, you come to certain conclusions, and then action is taken on that basis. So what this is doing is seeing the brain as kind of a piece of hardware and your thoughts are software. This perspective is often related to psychology and economics, because it kind of sees the individual decision maker as making rational decisions based on information available to that. And things such as game theory or economics explanations of motivation or human behavior have become kind of important in this cognitive psychology field. In fact, two psychologists, well, actually only one won the award. Daniel Kahneman from Princeton University was a psychologist and won the Nobel Prize in economics because his psychological research made such a contribution to our understanding of economics. So a question that's often made by the cognitive perspective is how can we make the brain more efficient, effective in processing information? So they look at things where the brain, in a sense, takes shortcuts and has created some processing biases so that people often get things wrong. And why do people get things wrong? So, for example, there's something called the endowment effect, which means we tend to put a higher value on things we own than other people would put the value that other people would put on the objects that we own. So the point is that if you're given something, you tend to value it more, even though like it never cost you anything, while other people might have a different idea of what the money value of an item is. Um, a key thing by Kahneman, the researcher Kahneman and Tversky, is that we have very patterned mistakes in the way that we make judgment about decisions, and that these mistakes are rooted in what he called heuristics or small shortcuts or rules of thumb as a way of guiding our behavior, which means that we don't actually process all the information. We have filters that basically take information in, put it into a certain framework, and on the basis of that we make decisions for. So some of these cognitive biases are kind of outlined here in this graph. One is the anchoring effect, which means that when your conclusions are based upon what it's compared to. So, for example, if I show you a house that is, average, and before that, I showed you a house that is, let's say, dilapidated. You probably think that average house is really much better than average. But if I show you a really nice house first, and then I show you, let's say, an average house, the conclusion I'm going to get from here is that it's valuable because its competitors are houses that are perhaps not as nice. So we'll get into more what some of these like cognitive biases and heuristics are later on in the course. But for now, just know that there are different ways explaining how the mind systematically makes mistakes in processing information is what is at the core of the cognitive approach to psychology. Another approach is the humanistic approach. And the assumption under the humanistic approach is that people are basically good and that people are inclined to self-exploration and they're searching for more awareness and particularly self-awareness of the world around them. So what they see as the role of psychology is to remove barriers to personal growth, which means that we might have some hang-ups, we might have some difficulties, and these prevent us from, let's say, achieving our full potential. And so that they think psychology should be geared toward helping humans achieve their, not so much that it shouldn't be so much exclusively scientific, but the psychology should contribute to making people better adapted to the world and allowing them to a space to personally grow. So the key thing in the humanistic perspective is the celebration of creativity. So studies about what psychologically makes creativity more likely than not, but also that kind of prizes the people who are able to have outside the box thinking and disagree with people people in their peer group. And so what is happening in the humanistic perspective is that instead of treating philosophy as psychology, it's treating psychology as philosophy. And so a lot of what's going on here is like, how do we create people that share our personal values and using psychology as a means to kind of demonstrate the validity or the attractiveness of our own political values. And so in some ways it's reducing psychology to a form of ethical like philosophy. A key figure in this field is Abraham Maslow, and he famously called the hierarchy of human needs that kind of studied about moral and character development and how that when certain basic needs are satisfied, we will move up to another level and challenge ourselves more than in a process that continues over the entire lifespan of an adult individual. So kind of illustrating Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I'm just going to kind of hand wave at this a little bit because we'll get more into depth onto Maslow's idea. But basically, Maslow said we have a variety of different human needs. Some of these are more important than others, but we need to take care of the ones that are more basic or ones that are more at the bottom of the pyramid, such as your need for food or sleep or sex or water, etc. And then once you satisfy those needs, you can move on to the next level, which would be safety needs. And having them satisfied safety needs, we can move on to our relationships with our family. And what he's trying to get at here is that the way to self-actualization is mostly by not in a sense jumping over the steps in the process, but it's built upon kind of a good foundation of our understanding um, of our basic needs. And these ideas are very influential in school settings where there's a lot of effort and a lot of resources spent toward providing, let's say, some of the basic needs such as food, making sure that people are in a good state of mind, that they're safe before that they are engaging in classroom and education. They're making sure that their basic needs are satisfied so that they'll pay more attention and they'll be more effective learners for themselves in the class. The final perspective is a social cultural perspective, and this is the idea that culture is grounded in individual psychology. And when you aggregate these individual perspectives about the world and you ask them about their values, you can start to see cultural patterns of behavior. And with the goal of promoting cross-cultural understanding by trying to make more explicit the way that people from different cultures perhaps think differently because of what they have gleaned from their culture and how that has influenced their way of thinking. So a famous one is by a Dutch social psychologist named Geert Hofstede. And Hofstede basically said, look, you can measure culture in a variety of different dimensions. And he used surveys of similar people. He got a large multinational firm, and he interviewed people from different branches of the company at the same level, meaning people promoted to this have the same educational background and are able to conduct similar types of um, basically trying to look at people who are similar in every single way, except from that they come from a different culture. And he found different dimensions that people have a more tolerance for authoritarianism and hierarchy versus a desire for more equality. We have cultures that are very individualistic, like the United States, and other cultures that are more collectivist that focus on belonging to a larger group. Once again, I'm not going to go into these all in detail, but the idea is that Hofstede and others have suggested that psychology might provide a key to understanding, let's say, the broader social culture. So, just concluding thoughts, I've covered a lot of different material and a lot of different schools of thought. I would like you to think about this. Which one of these sounds closest to your own ideas about psychology? Which one of these is the most persuasive way to explain how people think and why they behave in the way they do? And so just, take some time and do some introspection of like why some things seem more natural to you. So I'm just going to end this lecture here. Next time we'll talk a little bit more about experiment design and the experimental method, and talk about different ways of collecting information and doing valid psychology experiments that can lead to broadening our understanding of knowledge.